His family name is Edson Orantes do Nascimento, but people call him Pelé. He is the #1 player in the story of soccer. In 1,363 games, he scored 1,264 goals. With Brazil, he won the World Cup 3 times. He visited 88 countries, and his picture was in every newspaper. But Pelé is not only a famous soccer player. He knows Spanish, Italian, English, and French. He writes music, and he works for the Brazilian government. Today, Pelé is famous. In 1950, he was a boy of 10 with no shoes. This is his story. Early years. Edson Orantes do Nascimento came into the world on the night of October 23rd, 1940. His family called him Dico. They lived in a small house in Três Corações, Brazil. "Dico has soccer player's legs," his father said. "He's going to be a doctor, not a soccer player," Dico's mother, Celeste, said. Celeste was angry. Don Dino, Dico's father, was a soccer player, but he didn't make much money. Don Dino smiled. There were problems in the family about soccer, but there was a lot of love in the house, too. In 1944, the manager of Bauru Atletico, a big soccer club, talked to Don Dino. "We want a good soccer player," the man said. "It's not much money, but there's work in the town, too. Do you want the job?" Don Dino said yes, and the family moved to Bauru. The manager was wrong about one thing. There was no work for Don Dino in the town. He only played soccer, and the family had the same money problems. But Dico was happy in Bauru with his new friends. They played their first game of soccer in Rua Rubens Arruda, a street near Dico's house. Their football was an old newspaper. Little Dico played a lot of soccer. Celeste wasn't happy about this. "There's no money in the game," she said. Dico smiled. His mother was right. He loved soccer, but he didn't want to be a soccer player. He wanted to work at the airport. He often went there and looked at the airplanes. But Dico's first job wasn't in a soccer stadium or an airport. It was at Bauru Station in 1948. He cleaned shoes. In that year, things were difficult for the family. But then Don Dino started work in a doctor's office. He cleaned the building and answered the telephone. In the afternoons, Dico often visited his father. "In 10 years, you're going to be a young man," Don Dino said one day. "What do you want to do?" "I want to work with airplanes," Dico said. "Okay, but school is important for that," said his father. Later that year, Dico started school. He wasn't a good student. He only stayed in school because he wanted a job at the airport. But one day, an airplane came down near the school. Dico and his friends went to the doctor's office and looked in one of the windows. The man from the airplane was dead. Deco never talked about a job with airplanes again. A new name. The important thing for Deco now was soccer. Evenings and weekends he played with his friends. In the afternoons he was with Don Dino. Don Dino was his soccer teacher, and Deco was a very good student. After 2 years, Deco was the #1 young player in Baru. His friends started to call him PELE. Where does the name come from? People often ask. PELE doesn't know. In 1951, PELE started a club, September 7, with his friends. People called them the team with no shoes. They wanted to play in Baru Atletico's championship for young teams, but the shoes were a problem. One day, a father of one of the players came with shoes for the team. "Today I'm giving you a new name, Americano," he said. "Now they can't call you the team with no shoes." Americano played very well and won the championship. After the final, Don Dino looked at his son and smiled. "You played a beautiful game, Deco," he said. Valdemar de Brito. Baru Atletico liked Pele's beautiful game too. They wanted him for the club's new team of young players, Bacchino. The team manager was Valdemar de Brito, a famous man in Brazilian soccer. Pele was very happy. Valdemar was a good manager and a good teacher. In 1953, Bacchino won the Baru Young Team Championship. After this, Valdemar moved away. Pele was very sorry. 1 year later, Pele finished school and started to work in a shoe factory. At weekends, he played for Bacchino, but he didn't like the new manager. 1954 was a bad year. In the winter of the new year, Valdemar came to Pele's house. He wanted to talk to the family. "Your son is 15 now," he said. "He's a very good soccer player. He can try for a job with Santos." Don Dino and Pele were happy. Santos was a very famous club in Brazil. Celeste didn't like it, but she said yes. Some days later, Don Dino and Pele went to Santos on the train. "The Santos players aren't going to like me," Pele said. But there was no problem. Pele played well, and the club was happy with its new player. Pele was happy too. After some weeks, he had a good friend on the team. His name was Zito. Pele wasn't in the first team, but one day a first-team player, Vasconcelos, had an injury. "Let's put young Pele in the first team," the manager said. Pele played well and stayed in the first team. He scored his first goal for them on September 7th, 1956. After that, he started to score a lot of goals. The team were very happy. In June 1957, they played in the Maracanã Championship. Pele scored 8 goals. Suddenly, he was famous. Thank you, Valdemar, said Pele. The World Cup Games. Pele, 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 called the Brazilian soccer fans. The managers of the Brazilian team listened. Late in 1957, the names of the new Brazilian World Cup team were on the radio. Castillo, Gilmar, Mazzola, Pelé. Can that be right? Pelé asked. They want me? He was only 17. The 1958 World Cup Games were in Sweden. Pelé played very well. Brazil won their first games with no problems. Then they beat Russia 2-0. But it was a difficult game. Wales were a strong team too. But Pelé scored a goal, and Brazil won 1-0. The game with France wasn't difficult. Brazil won 5-2, and Pelé scored 3 goals. Now they were in the final with Sweden. Brazil didn't start well, and Sweden scored first. But then Brazil scored 5 goals. 2 of those goals were Pelé's, and Brazil won 5-2. Pelé scored 6 goals in his first World Cup. Brazil were the champions. Now Pelé wasn't only famous in Brazil. Pelé didn't play in the later games of the 1962 World Cup in Chile because he had an injury. He watched his team, and they beat Czechoslovakia 3-1 in the final. Brazil were the champions again, and Pelé was very happy for the team. The 1966 World Cup was in England. Pelé doesn't like remembering this championship. Usually, Brazil went to the games with 22 players. In England, they had 43. This was bad for the team because there were new players in every game. In an early game, Portugal beat them 3-1. The day after that game, Brazil went home. In 1970, the World Cup Championship was in Mexico. Pelé was only 29, but he was the old man of the Brazilian team. They beat Czechoslovakia 4-1. Then they played England, the world champions. It was a very interesting game, and Brazil won 1-0. After this, they beat Romania 3-2, and Pelé scored 2 goals. Then they played Peru in the Jalisco Stadium, and they won 4-2. Now there was only one game with Uruguay before the final. It was difficult, but Brazil won 3-1. The team went to Mexico City and waited for the final with Italy. The 1970 World Cup final started in the Aztec Stadium on the afternoon of June 21st, 1970. Pelé quickly scored a very good goal. There was a goal from Italy, but then Brazil scored 3 times. They won 4-1. After the game, Pelé said goodbye to World Cup soccer. People were very sorry. How many players in the world can say, "I won 3 World Cups"? They asked. There was only one answer. there was only one man. His name was PELE. A difficult girl. It was a Saturday night in 1958. PELE and Zito were in Santos again, after the World Cup. "There's a girls' ball game in the stadium," Zito said. "Let's go and watch." There was a young white girl at the ball game. She looked at PELE many times, and he looked at her. "You're the famous PELE, and you play for Santos," she said after the game. "That's right," PELE said. "Are you from the town?" "Yes," the girl said, "but I don't like soccer." Then she walked away. "Who was that?" Zito asked. PELE smiled. "A difficult girl," he said. PELE liked the difficult girl, but he didn't know her name. He talked to her friends. "Her name's Rosemary Colby," they said. "She works in a music store." That same week, PELE went to the store. Rosemary was there. They talked for some time. Then PELE asked, "Can you come out with me sometimes?" "I'm sorry," Rosemary said. "I'm only 14. I don't go out with boys. But come to my house one afternoon." PELE was a visitor at Rosemary's house for 7 years. Then, in February 1965, they married. The boy with no shoes and the difficult girl were very happy. PELE's years with Santos. PELE played for Santos from August 1956 to October 1974. In those years, they were the #1 club in Brazil and the world. They won the Brazilian Championship in 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, and 1965. They won the South American Club Championship in 1962, 1963, and 1968. And they won the World Club Championship in the same years. PELE and the Santos team visited many countries and played a lot of games. Sometimes this was difficult for PELE. He didn't like staying in hotels all the time. He wanted to be home in Brazil with his family. PELE's final game for Santos was on October 2nd, 1974. The game was with Ponte Preta. After a short time, PELE stopped playing. He had the ball in his hands and looked at the fans in the stadium. "Thank you," he said, and he walked away from the game. "We love you," called the fans. After Santos, PELE went to New York for a job with an American team, New York Cosmos. The job was for $4,700,000. Many people in Brazil were unhappy about this. "PELE is only going for the money," they said. But they were wrong. PELE wanted to make soccer famous in the U.S. He did this, and his new team were very happy. PELE stayed with New York Cosmos for 3 years. His final game was on October 1st, 1977. It was with his old club, Santos. Pele played for his new team and then for Santos. He scored a good goal and said goodbye to soccer. After soccer. Pelé didn't stop working. He wasn't only a good soccer player and teacher. He loved young people, too. He worked for UNICEF and talked with governments about the problems of the world's children. Then, in 1995, he started to work for the Brazilian government. But the world's soccer fans remember him for his 2 good feet and say, "Thank you, Pelé, soccer champion of the world."